Hello, hello, and welcome to another podcast episode of Overpowering Emotions, where I talk all things big emotions, emotion regulation, self regulation. I'm on my self regulation mini series. I'm talking more about different interventions when we're looking at self regulation, which is a learnable skill and it develops throughout the lifetime. Okay, it's the last part of the brain to develop. We know that we need to help kids co-regulate over time, but it is a skill that's learnable and it can be strengthened. Even if you're an adult who needs to work on self-regulation, we can always strengthen it. Now, last week I talked about different domains and we can target any one of those domains. Like I said, last week I focus a lot on the emotional domain. In my own workshops, that's usually what I focus on. If I have multi-day workshops, it's fantastic because then I can go in depth into all of those domains. But if I only have a few hours or one day, I usually just focus on those emotional pieces. Now, I always talk about being proactive. It's not just about using a strategy in the moment. We got to teach the skill and practice the skill and be very proactive, as there's a lot of front loading that needs to go on. Knowing that managing impulses and those automatic sort of emotional reactions is one of the toughest things for kids and even adults to do, right? So we need to make sure we're setting up the environment to help them be successful in the first place. That's really important. I talked last week about making habits so automatic, making habits, making strategies so automatic that it becomes the first automatic response. So if right now the kid's first automatic response is to punch or to scream, we want their first automatic response to be the strategy to manage that frustration. Right. And so we want to make sure we're practicing. It's helpful to preempt situations too that would otherwise require a lot of effortful self control, which is harder as their battery is emptying. It's harder to do if they're hungry, if they're tired, if it's the end of the day, if something else emotionally just happened. So I'll run through a different types of interventions, and then we can look at ones that sort of cut across everything. I usually take a very trans-diagnostic approach, where and trans theoretical approach as well, that's going to address all emotions. Now, in our younger kids, our early elementary kids, we know that in the schools, curriculum-based interventions are usually the most common. The majority of them, not all of them, but the majority of them do show consistent improvements in self-regulation. They do help with that better academic achievement, social skills, fewer behavioral problems. So those are the interventions that are usually done in the classroom, right? And we're using strategies in circle time, through storytelling. We're using self-talk for younger children, maybe some role playing. We're doing a lot of modeling, talking through the processes, psychoeducation. Once they get a little bit older, right? They can sit and actually learn some of these things. So we're looking at those curriculum-based things. Mindfulness-based interventions, these are important for everybody, no matter what the age. Some do include yoga interventions. They do show a lot of promise, and we need to have mindfulness. I always talk about the work that we do with our kids is in the now, because if they're in the past, if they're in the future, they're never able to take in all of the information in their environment. So it's all about in the now, and we do know that this is really important for self-regulation. They again, academic achievement, it helps reduce risks of substance use, reduce mental health problems in the future, right? The best benefits of mindfulness approaches are really in our older teens in terms of improving those executive functions, right? That self-regulating brain, because of their heightened brain plasticity. There's a lot of learning going on in those teenage years. They have a better ability than younger kids to self-reflect. So mindfulness is really important for our older kids, even managing disruptive behavior and those types of things. The disruptive behavior for younger kids can also be helpful. But that mindfulness is so important for so many reasons. When we're looking at self-regulation, it's helping them focus on the present moment. And when we're in the present moment, we can be curious. And when we're curious, we can keep the prefrontal cortex online and we can accept whatever's happening because we're removed. We're a little bit more objective, right? And so that's what my goal is. What do we need to do to keep our self-regulating prefrontal cortex online? Then we can enhance core cognitive skills from there, right? And then again, it's supporting all of those other things like school and social functioning and all of that kind of thing. But self-regulation really must happen now. And so that's why mindfulness is really important to focus on that self-regulation. For younger kids, mindfulness, we want to practice the skill. We want to make it so automatic, but it really does help with some more of the behaviors versus the executive functions, which is better for the older kids. We also know CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, can really help by. I don't really focus on the C part because usually when we focus on the B part, the C part just comes along. But the C part is, challenging, um, trying to reframe those problematic thoughts or beliefs or attitudes. Really, that's kind of what it's focusing on. CBT is very problem focused, it's very action oriented, right? We're focusing on teaching new sort of information processing skills, teaching new coping mechanisms. Now, with CBT, a lot of kids, our 3 to 6 year olds, our younger kids, it's really helpful for them to start learning to recognize and understand and manage what's coming up, their emotions. And emotions, remember, involve their thoughts, involve the physiological feelings, and their behavioral sort of impulses. So if we're using age appropriate activities like interactive exercises, we will throw some mindfulness in there, some positive self-talk, right? That can be really helpful. Of course, definitely helpful for our older kids, but here we're focusing on identifying those unhelpful thought patterns. I use a lot of optical illusions to show how our brain is easily persuaded. Not just optical illusions, auditory illusions as well, right? Our brain processes information. It's not necessarily correct. So being able to identify and modify those unhelpful thoughts, but also behavioral patterns as well. A lot of resilience programs, which we know are helpful for older kids, 12 to adulthood, use a lot of these CBT strategies as well. Now, one, of course, is challenging those negative thought patterns because we're going to start questioning them. We're going to start, is this actually true? Let's look for evidence for, evidence against. What would we tell a friend? We would do all of these types of things to sort of reframe them in in sort of reality, right? Versus the catastrophizing sort of things. So CBT really gets kids to slow down, which we want them to do, keep their prefrontal cortex online, and reflect on what went wrong, why, how can we fix it for next time. So it's a lot of that self-reflection for the older kids. It's boosting that self-awareness, which we know is really important for identifying their emotions and understanding the impact. Goal setting and planning is really important here. So that includes being able to persist, especially if we've got a complex sort of long-term project, like maybe it's applying to university, maybe it's managing work or schoolwork. Right. So kids are really learning to problem solve, use those skills, and address any of those emotional triggers effectively. Cognitive reappraisal is part of this too. So that's changing the cognitive representation of a situation to be able to alter the emotional responses. So if a kiddo, for example, is taught to focus on abstract features of a tempting stimuli, so maybe they really want to eat. Last week I talked about the marshmallow experiment. So maybe they've got this temptation, they've got this marshmallow right here, but thinking of it as a puffy, round cloud that's floating rather than the immediate, it's so delicious, it's sweet, I want to eat it, right? So that could be something that we do. So those are some of the cognitive strategies. Like I said, I personally don't usually focus on those right away. There is a time and a place, but I do a lot of behavioral strategies first. I actually don't even teach the cognitive stuff other than the emotional framework, right? Emotions involve the cognitive pieces. So I teach that, but I'm not trying to change thoughts. I really focus on the mindfulness of noticing them, being aware of them, right? Maybe creating some distance from them, but it's through the behavioral things that we'll actually start reframing them, right? And so usually we can just have a good debrief. That's really important to be able to manage changing some of those thoughts. So behaviorally, we would focus on things like impulse control, response inhibition to manage some of those impulses. I've talked a lot about this. Structured teaching interactions where we're actually saying, okay, kiddo, I'm going to put you in this situation that maybe causes frustration or that maybe you're likely to eat the thing or swipe the thing or whatever it is. And so your job is to keep your prefrontal cortex online, to be the boss and do the opposite. So we're practicing as close to real life situations as possible. That's really important. Okay, because if we talk about it, usually they have the skill, they know the skill, they just can't implement the skill. They just can't do it in the heat of the moment. Okay, so it's really important that we're practicing. Maybe we're practicing and role playing, in a session, but then we got to go practice in the real world. So if we're practicing resisting stealing or delayed gratification, we're going to do those exposures in their environment where those problems are usually happening. Okay. So that's going to be really important. And we're developing adaptive behaviors. So we're teaching and practicing how to act in the way that we want them to act or that they want to be acting. So it's just to match that situation. Developing healthy habits is a key part of this as well. Automatizing those routines and behaviors aligned with those long-term goals. So we don't have to worry about the willpower that we just don't have a lot of. We just don't, our brains aren't built to have that willpower. There's also the emotional strategies too. So that will target all of the domains, right? Identifying our emotions and the feelings, understanding, recognizing and labeling their feelings and how those feelings manifest, emotionally in the body, right? That's really the first step in effectively managing them. And I am going to go into a little branch of this self-regulation mini series into an emotion, building up that emotional literacy. I know I've talked a lot about it in the past few years, but I want to go even deeper. I'm going to really deep dive into them. So definitely check out upcoming episodes because kids learning to manage their emotions, to be able to react appropriately, they need to have those precursor skills, right? And so how are they feeling? What's happening around them? What's happening in that moment? Now, distress tolerance to manage those intense emotions without resorting to maladaptive behaviors is so important. And that's why I do a lot of emotion exposures, distress exposures, right? And so we want to make sure we're doing that. And we also want to look at reducing vulnerability by not just trying to manage and down regulate those unpleasant emotions. What if we accumulate and upregulate and have more of those pleasant emotions? That's really important too, right? So we want to make sure we're balancing that and focusing on that, having fun and engagement and connection, right? But we also want to be planning some of the coping mechanisms in advance to help them handle difficult experiences. It doesn't make sense if we know every time we give them, a math worksheet that they freak out, that we're not proactively supporting them so that they can be successful to do their math worksheet without freaking out. That's really important. So when we're looking at CBT, it's really, strengthening those brain mechanisms involved in self-regulation, in those executive functions, the cold system's ability to override those impulses from the hot system, right? Especially when there's conflict between competing goals. I know I need to do my homework, but I really want to play my game. So it's encouraging the want to motivation over have to motivation. And so if I want to, that's going to lead to stronger pursuit of whatever it is, right? So being able to work there. The other one is DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, which is another branch of, this behaviorism. And it really can be helpful for addressing emotional dysregulation, especially for our older kids, our teenagers, our 12 to 18-year-olds. It was actually adapted from CBT for chronically suicidal clients, but it's really evolved. It's sort of this third wave of CBT. And the core of DBT is to balance and sort of synthesize acceptance and change-oriented strategy. So accepting whatever it is that's coming up rather than trying to change it, right? Specifically, although we are focusing on some of those change-oriented strategies, but people learn to manage their emotions to react appropriately to how they're feeling and what's happening in the world around them in adaptive ways, more adaptive ways. I would say they are probably responding in adaptive ways for them, but not necessarily like in the moment, but not on the broader sort of bigger long-term picture. So from this approach, kids are really learning four core sets of behavioral skills. First is mindfulness. This is why I focus on mindfulness so much. It's so important no matter what approach we take. So focusing intentionally focusing, directing our attention to the present moment, from moment to moment experiences. We want to have that attitude of curiosity, an attitude of acceptance, right? Not trying to get rid of it. It's like, oh, interesting. I feel like I'm having a heart attack right now. Ooh, interesting. I am burning with anger right now. So it's being mindfully aware of what's going on internally so that we can keep that self regulating brain online. We can take a step back and observe the thoughts and the feelings, whatever that emotion is coming up without the immediate reaction. And that's a key component of self awareness and self control. So that's why mindfulness is so important because we've really lost touch with our internal experiences, and kids, especially, really have lost this. So we want to focus on that. The next is distress tolerance. I always am focusing on this distress tolerance. That's the emotional brain. Kids need to learn to manage intense emotions. They need to manage difficult experiences without resorting to maladaptive behaviors. And this is why avoidance is so problematic because they never have the experiences to manage. We're trying to make them feel better all the time, and they're never learning these skills, right? So we always need to focus on practicing distress in real time. I'm asking parents, I'm asking teachers, put them in a distressing situation. We need to push their buttons. Oh my gosh, I can't do that. We're trying to avoid it. We're already walking on eggshells. Well, yeah, you're walking on eggshells because they don't know how to manage. They need these experiences. DBT does include things like activating the parasympathetic system. So, doing things like reducing the body temperature. Maybe there's intense exercise. Maybe there's paced breathing, right? But they're also learning to manage extreme conditions by applying mindfulness skills. The third skill is emotion regulation. So, again, understanding, naming, modifying those emotional responses. So, again, we're seeing these similar skills across different approaches. It's the trans theoretical sort of approach. It's what are the things that are going to cut across all emotional needs and emotion regulation. So there's loads of strategies here when we're looking at the emotional responses, of course, recognizing and labeling those feelings. I do love identifying obstacles and changing emotions where kids are understanding what prevents them from managing their emotions effectively, right? What's getting in the way of you managing the Hulk. Right. And so, how do we target that? There's also techniques like opposite action. I do always talk about what is it that anxiety wants you to do? It wants you to run away. What's the opposite? Face, right? Go into the situation. And that's really what this is. Kids are responding with behaviors that are opposite to what the emotions want them to do. So, emotion might want them to yell. So, the opposite would maybe to be whisper, for example, right? Rather than avoiding, running away, we're going to move forward. Fact checking is also part of this challenge, and that's part of the CBT as well. We're going to challenge our irrational, all or nothing, catastrophic, self critical thoughts, right? So for young kids, they might become thought detectives. So if their brain says, everybody hates me, we're going to ask, is that really true? What's the evidence showing that everybody hates you? Mom and dad, teachers, EA, this friend, that friend, right? What's the evidence against the thought? When was a time today someone was kind to you? And understanding, is your brain sort of in a worried mood or a grumpy mood right now? Right. So that they can see everybody. And then they're got to go, yeah, but no, no, like my best friend, no, and this person, no, but them, they for sure hate me. Right. Then maybe we need to operationalize. What does that actually mean? How do you know that they hate you? What is it that they're doing? Have they come up to you and said, I hate you? We don't know, right? So, oh, if they're like, no, but for sure, I just know that they do. Oh man, you can read minds. That's so cool. What am I thinking right now? Right. And so they're like, well, I can't really read minds. Well, if you can't read my mind, can you actually read their mind? Like what's going through their mind right now? Right. So we can do those types of things. I really love the externalization. And so we can talk about mind reading Mandy. Man, I'm having trouble with words today. So that really works for young kids. It works for older kids too, even adults. I do that all the time. So seeing if those the henchmen are the ones who spin these stories to ring the amygdala and freak us out, right? Seeing them if they're stuck. I show videos. If you know me, you will understand some of the videos. One of them, my favorite one, is stuck on an escalator, right? Because people are caught in the emotion of, oh my gosh, I'm trapped on this escalator. I need help. Not seeing the bigger picture. If they were mindful, they could see the big picture. I could just walk off. Right. So being able to show them that video and identifying mind reading Mandy is showing up right now. They didn't text back. So therefore they're mad at me. How do you know that for sure? What are some other ways that, what are some other things that could be happening right now that they couldn't text you back right now? Or catastrophizing Carl, it's the end of the universe, right? So here we can ask, what's the evidence? What could you say to a friend in this situation? Okay. Reducing vulnerability is important. So if kids are hungry, tired, sick, stressed out, they're going to be way more vulnerable to those big emotions and to impulsive reactive behaviors. And so we want to make sure that the strategies that we're using are really going to help kiddos strengthen that emotion regulation base. So I'm always saying that Maslow's hierarchy, if those basic needs aren't being addressed, like if they're not getting sleep and nutrition and hydration, all of our strategies are going to go out the window. They're not going to be as effective. So you can think of a PLEASE acronym. Okay, so the PL is physical illness. And so that can include resting, hydrating, all of those types of things is going to be really important. E is eating balanced meals so that they're not hangry, right? A is avoiding things that change their mood. What changes mood in our teenagers? Vaping, alcohol, maybe too much caffeine, right? So some of those things that are going to trigger them. S, crux, sleep, right? We know is critical for self-regulation. If that kid's not sleeping, it's going to be so much harder. Why are we, beating our head against the wall if they're not sleeping? E is regular exercise. So that's the baseline of well-being, right? So just reducing the vulnerability, addressing those things to start with, just to build up our success. And then planning those coping mechanisms in advance is really important. And I kind of mentioned that already, but this is where maybe they're visualizing and rehearsing using those strategies before the challenge happens and then practicing in a semi-challenging situation. And then we're going to go throw them in. What will you do if it rains and recess is canceled? So the plan might be, well, I'm going to bring a game to school that we can play inside. And I'm going to ask my friend to join. Or with a teen, how are you going to handle if you see a party, you're trying to study and there was a party on Snapchat and you weren't invited, right? What are you going to do so that you can focus on your studying for your huge, your MCATs or whatever, your huge test that's coming up tomorrow? Well, maybe the plan's going to be I'm just going to turn off my phone and give it to my mom so she's got it. I don't even know what's there. And if I do happen to have it, I'm just going to log off and remind myself, right? Maybe it's not personal, whatever. This is more important. I'm going to text a friend I trust. We're not going to change the emotion. Their disappointment and feeling left out is still going to be there, but we got to make sure we're addressing that plan, being proactive. Right. And again, if we're focusing so much on down regulating emotions, I'm always talking about how do we accumulate those positive emotions. And that's one thing I really love DBT for, because it really is focusing on that, getting kids to regularly engage in activities that bring joy and connection and meaning, even if it's small. This is the behavior activation piece, right? So it could be playing a favorite game with a friend or a sibling, going on a nature walk, right? Going to find 5 cool things on your nature walk. Maybe making a gratitude chain. Maybe it's having a little dance party. That's one of the best things for me. Maybe it's creating a happy memory box with photos or drawings that they can, look at. So we want to start looking at this. Maybe for teens, it's joining a club or starting a hobby or volunteering or planning, something that they can look forward to, like a coffee break with a friend after they study. Making these things as routine as possible is really helpful, because even if we get tired, we don't want to go, no, I don't feel like doing that, right? So maybe having a 3-2-1 check-in. 3 things that made me feel good today, 2 people that I felt connected to today, 1 thing I want to try this week, something like that, right? Just building these rituals. Then, of course, there's problem solving skills to address those emotional triggers, right? Managing actions and impulses effectively. There's lots of practice here. So it's really teaching the adaptive coping so that they can manage whatever feelings are coming up and so they can react appropriately, right? Reducing the need for trying to self-control themselves all the time because it's so limited, right? We want those brain mechanisms for self-control to come online without exhausting them. Now, the 4th piece is interpersonal effectiveness when we're looking at DBT. And so that's focusing on skills of self-respect, treating others with care, showing interest, validation, respect, assertiveness. It's really balancing our own needs with other people's needs, but we're maintaining our self respect and what it is that we need, right? We know that improving social functioning and relationships is critical for our kids' well being. It can reduce any interpersonal distress, which is where a lot of distress comes from anyway. And that's a common, trigger for a lot of emotional dysregulation. So DBT is really good at addressing the fact that this emotional upset comes from a combination of both biological, what's going on inside internally, and environmental factors. So maybe our emotions aren't being validated, our needs are not being met. And I love that too, because I'm always saying it's not the kid's responsibility to cope because there's so many systemic factors around them. And so we're understanding the combination of those environmental factors. And so that really brings me to family based interventions. And this is usually my point of entry, right? It's really important that we're addressing. And I talk about family, but it's not just immediate parents, right? Or immediate caregivers. It can be teachers and mentors and coaches and other important adults in the life. But all of these caregivers, they're critical to healthy development throughout, someone's childhood into young adulthood. And self-regulation develops significantly through our warm and responsive relationships with those important people in their life, right? So it can include anybody. We know parent training programs are really helpful to get parents, thinking about how to help their kids manage difficult emotions through co-regulation. And so that really involves supporting and coaching and modeling those self-regulation skills, as well as structuring the environment to make sure that the self-regulation is manageable. And maybe it's buffering against environmental stressors, especially ones that we have control of that aren't necessarily needed. Kids need to have stressors to build resilience, but those are types of things that can be helpful. Exercise-based physical activity, those interventions are very helpful, especially for our tweens and teens. I love team sports, right? They have a major social protective factor. But when we're looking at self-regulation, the research shows martial arts-based interventions specifically have a lot of promise that contribute to those executive functioning skills and even things like academic achievement. We can focus on social and personal skill interventions. So, focusing on personal responsibility, modeling behavior, conflict resolution, right? That can be effective in improving specific aspects of self regulation, like the delayed gratification, attention, all of those types of things. So there's lots of different programs. I will be getting into specific skills and how to build them, but I just want to give that overview. There are things like, zones of regulation where we're working on improving kids' self-awareness, their self-management, making responsible decisions, right? I find a lot of programs like this, the only problem is there's too much focus on the individual child and self-control. And so that's why I prefer something like Shanker's self-reg approach because it's more of a process than a program, first of all, which is most important. Because if we're just doing this 8-week program, it's like we deliver it and then we are done with it. No, we got to be embedding it all the time into the broader context. So, and it's not focusing on self-control for the kid, which I think we rely too much on. I'm teaching this kid these skills so that they can self-control. No, it's about being proactive, addressing the environment, addressing the relationships, right? Not adding on unnecessary stress that makes it so hard for our kids to regulate in the first place. So the process is really helping us getting to think and understand and respond to stressors, bringing in the self-regulation brain online, but also looking at those systemic and the environmental things. So it's really inherently flexible, it's adaptive, it's emphasizing observation, reflection, trial and error, self-awareness, and making sure that we are creating the environment for them to self-regulate in the first place. There's lots of programs and strategies out there, right, that are effective. There's so much variability in outcomes, though. So I don't personally follow any one program. I really take that trans-theoretical, trans-diagnostic approach to look at what are good for human beings based on what we know about the brain and based on functioning, right? So beyond those specific program types, those overarching strategies that support cognitive regulation or emotion regulation or, whatnot is really important to look at. I did develop a self-regulation pyramid, right? So aside from basic healthy functioning needs, right, that Maslow's hierarchy of sleep and all of those types of things, We want to make sure we're looking at the environment. And the environment includes our relationships. So, caregiver support, co regulation. That's always where we need to start, right? Considering their environmental needs, all of those things. So, reducing those unnecessary environmental stressors. That's important, especially if we have kiddos who are experiencing adversity in their life. How can we buffer negative effects on self regulation? And then we can build from there with stressors because they do need stressors. I'm not saying eliminate stressors, I'm just saying eliminate unnecessary stressors. Okay. Then, of course, there's the direct skills instruction where we're intentionally and systematically teaching things. And these are the things that I will be getting into in next, like in upcoming. It might be weeks away because I've got so much that I want to get to. But the planning, the problem solving, the focusing our attention, the goal setting, monitoring our progress with our goals, our delayed gratification, just self monitoring, decision making, all of those things. So watch out for those. That's really important. Mindfulness, you heard, is important across all approaches, right? That's definitely something that we need to check out. But a lot of it is focusing on, yes, I will be talking about cognitive strategies, but I really want to make sure that we're looking at some of those emotional strategies. Um, I do take, like I said, that systemic lens. And so I want to focus next week on some of the contextual and developmental factors that can really affect kids' ability to self regulate. But I'll leave that there for today. That was a broad overview of all of the different types of interventions that we know are effective for self regulation. And I will be going into very specific interventions and strategies and those types of things, but it's good just to have this foundation and understanding before we go. So go have a fantastic day. Help those kiddos be bold and courageous, and I will see you next time.